campus. Is, is that the same thing or no? Different. Okay, Baltimore County. Yep, University of Maryland, Baltimore County. He teaches a course in post World War II United States history with an emphasis on African American politics. His first book was Rumor, Repression, and Racial Politics: How the Harassment of Black Elected Officials Shaped Post Civil Rights America. And his current book that we're talking about was published in 1917. I mean, 1917. Yes, when he was 3. It was 2017. I'm sorry. Is Chocolate City: A History of Race and Democracy in the Nation's Capital. Thank you so much for joining us, Derek. You have your microphone.
Thank you, Andy, for having me.
Absolutely. I wanted to ask you the choice of the word Chocolate City, of course, is can you use the
Yes.
It works. The choice of the word Chocolate City is a very charged word. It's a political word, right? I mean, a lot of people when they refer to, I don't know how many people like, was Chocolate City like a known term, or was it like within the Black community kind of term?
Sure, sure. So first off, I have to give Andy his due, and I have to begin by thanking all of you for coming out in the rain. I know that DC folks, it rains and it's like it snows 2 feet if you're from Chicago. So I really appreciate y'all for coming out and honoring this wonderful institution that Andy and his crew has built. I also want to say that I returned to DC after finishing my doctorate in 2005. And so the same year that Busboys opened. And so immediately I went into this new place where I could write during the day before I had to go work with the Congressional Black Caucus, or eventually at the University District of Columbia. And on Tuesday mornings, I used to sit at the big table at the 14th Street location. And that's where I met Andy. He used to sit there with Ethelbert Miller, and they talked politics every Tuesday morning. And it was a remarkable education in just the history of left-wing politics in the city, the present of left-wing politics in the city. And so, Andy, thank you for that. That is in part one of the big reasons I kept coming back, is also really good food. So we chose the name Chocolate City almost immediately. The way that the book came together was that I met Chris Ash at the University District of Columbia. I was still finishing my first book, and he said, I want us to write a book on race and governance in the nation's capital. I sort of told him this story where I ended it by saying, I really wish I had a book like this to help me structure my lectures. So I was teaching a DC history course at UDC. And he said, we should write that book. And here's a book proposal that I worked on over the weekend. Let's edit it together. We'll send it out, and we'll write this thing together. And I was just like, I don't even know you that well, dude. But we decided to do that. And after we finished the editing together, I said, well, we have to call this Chocolate City. Now, my motivation for this was, there were a lot of reasons for it. The first is that my dad was a huge P-Funk fan. And for those of you who know Parliament Funkadelic, which is this famous funk band that had probably one of its largest followings per capita here in Washington, D.C. in the 60s and 70s. They would do 3 or 4 shows per year in the 60s in different colleges. And they'd actually gotten the idea for some of their best songs from the audience shouting stuff at them at some of the shows in D.C. And my father had, of course, introduced me to their 1975 album, which was called Chocolate City, and it was an ode to Washington, D.C. It is not their best music, but it is one of their most beautiful album covers, I would argue. And so I said, look, we've got to call it that, because this is the nickname that people used for Washington, D.C., and then P-Funk took that nickname sort of off the streets and broadcast it to the rest of the country. The other reason I insisted that we use the name, though, is because, as you read a second ago, I chose a really poor title for my first book. It was not snappy. It's very long. You invariably sort of stumble over it. And I was like, we got to have something snappy.
Was that your PhD?
It was my dissertation.
Dissertation. Yeah, you could tell it was a dissertation. Like
yeah,
it sounded like one.
And so Chocolate City it was. Chris was on it from jump start.
Very good. One of the things that you talk about Washington, D.C., You say that Washington is a city like no other city in the United States for many reasons. Can you please explain what that means?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest reason is that the Constitution sets Washington, D.C. apart its form of governance from any other place in the country, not just any other city in the country, but any other place in the country. Um, and so you have a city that is going to be the repository of all the major institutions of American democracy: the Capitol, the White House, the Supreme Court, etc. The inauguration is here, and so it's sort of the stage for the pageantry of American democracy. And yet, written into the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17, if you were a bunch of pill nerds, I'd say you could pull out your pocket Constitution and look it up. And it says quite specifically, Congress has the power of exclusive legislation, meaning exclusive oversight over the nation's capital, not to exceed 10 miles square. And so written into that document is this mechanism for Congress to do whatever it chooses here. Now, Congress has done all types of things with that clause. At some times, it has wiped out democracy, the democratic process in the city entirely. For 100 years, from the 1870s all the way to the 1970s, we didn't have a city government. Congress administered the city indirectly through 3 presidentially appointed commissioners, right? So you couldn't vote for dog catcher here, right? It's kind of crazy, particularly after World War II. I mean, here we are, the capital of the free world, and nobody votes. At other times, though, Congress has bequeathed us home rule. And so back in the early 19th century, from about 1802 to 1874, we had a local government. And then from 1974 until the present, we've had a local government. But what Congress giveth, Congress can always taketh away. And so, a lot of the radical activists that we really came to focus on in 1960s and 1970s DC were people who just said, look, Congress has always been wishy-washy about this city. It's given us democracy, it's taken democracy away. The only really real way to solve this problem is to take ourselves out of the grasp of Congress. And so the idea is to shrink the federal district down to just the mall, the White House, and the Capitol, and a couple of Smithsonians or something. Nobody lives there, but literally no one lives there except for the president. And the president is always registered to vote somewhere else. And then the populated parts of the district will become its own state, right? That's always been the pitch of these statehood activists that have been very active in the city since the 1960s. And they have, over the course of the last 50, 60 years or so, kind of embedded their favored strategy for how we resolve the issue that the founders left us in the way that the city struggles for self-determination. There are other ways to get out from under Congress, retrocession to Maryland, for instance. But statehood has become the city's favorite strategy since roughly 1900.
So that's coming up very clearly these days because of new threats by the federal government to take over DC, and we're seeing that. But my issue has always been is that it seems most of the residents of the district, and correct me if I'm wrong, don't really give a damn. I mean, I think there's a certain elite group of people, the people in the know, the people that are in the party, the people that are part of the system. Yes, they'll be there calling for statehood.
Mm-hmm.
But the average person down the street, they may say, yeah, I want statehood, but they're not passionate about it.
Right.
They're not willing to go out in the streets and demonstrate. They're not willing to hold a pitchfork and go in front of Congress and say, give me statehood. There's always a handful of people that do that. And the reason why I say that, not I mean to talk too long here, but the reason why I say that, I used to be on the board of DC Vote. And DC Vote, their only purpose was to create statehood, to get 2 elected, senators and an elected congressperson in Congress so that we can have representation. And every on Emancipation Day, which is April 16th in Washington D.C., every Emancipation Day they bring as many people as they could possibly bring to the mall or somewhere and do a big rally. The rallies never amounted to more than maybe, at best, 1,000 people. And I'm talking about people you had to put on buses and give them ham sandwiches to show up. So I'm trying to understand where is the and why is there no passion for this? And maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm misreading, but tell me, my reading is that there's no passion for it. You think there may be, or
So, I mean, that is an excellent question. You were part of what was, I think some people see a hopeless cause, I suppose in the 90s of DC Vote or early 2000s. Now on the board of DC Vote. And, after a couple of years of thinking that maybe statehood is really on the horizon, a statehood bill passed the House of Representatives in 2021 or 2020 and then 2021. We're now looking at, sort of violations of the principle of home rule into at least the next 3 years, and a taste for doing that among the right wing of the Republican Party well after Trump leaves office when he's supposed to constitutionally. So I think there's two ways to look at this, and I honestly don't know a direct answer to your question. The first is to say that hopeless causes tend not to get people but so excited. And it's been 225 years since Congress came to town and stripped the residents of the area that became the District of Columbia of their vote in Congress. Before, when DC was being built, 1790 to 1800, the people who lived here could vote in Maryland and Virginia elections. So they could vote for members of Congress. And once Congress comes to town and strips them of that right, there's been an almost constant effort on the part of a small group of activists, as you point out, to try and get those rights returned. Oftentimes that struggle is stair steps, right? So you're going to struggle for home rule before you struggle for a vote in Congress. You're going to struggle for a vote in Congress, say through a constitutional amendment, before you struggle for statehood. And I think a lot of DC residents, year after year after year, seeing not just that they're probably not going to get to their goal, but in fact, every generation or so their goal gets rolled back, have said, leave that foolishness to someone else. I also think that Marion Barry had a really good insight about this. So Marion Barry is, of course, our mayor for life, four-term mayor of the District of Columbia, civil rights, black power activist before he got into electoral politics here in the district. And Marion Barry's sort of great innovation in the field of struggling for DC self-determination was that he was able to communicate. This is when he was running the Free DC movement in 1966. And so his big problem, the city's big problem in 1966 was that President Johnson and many activists in the civil rights movement, liberals in Congress, believed that it was long past due that the district had home rule. But they were receiving all of this opposition from segregationists in Congress who really wanted to, they didn't want to enfranchise a majority black city. And they had the support of the business community, which thought, why would we want to have to negotiate with a government that is responsible to the people and therefore can be quite fickle, when we can just sit down at the Century Club or Cosmos Club, sort of elite clubs here in the city, pour a glass of brandy, have a couple of cigars, work out some deals with a couple members of Congress, and done deal. We've got what we need, right? Whereas if it's a proper city government, we got to go through hearings, all that democratic foolishness, right? And so when Lyndon Johnson begins pushing forward the idea of home rule legislation, the business community stands with these segregationists against it. And Marion Barry forms the Free DC movement with a bunch of other local activists. Said we're going to put pressure on those businesses because we can touch them. We can't touch members of Congress who are elected by someone else. And we're going to sort of force them to back home rule by saying we'll boycott your business unless you switch sides and support DC self-determination. And through that campaign, he does something that I don't think many members of the city's current political elite do today. And that is he was able to communicate to DC residents the ways in which our lack of self-determination impoverished their everyday lives. So he'd go into slums and he'd say, the rat problem that you have. And DC had, quite literally in the late 1960s, one of the worst rat infestations of a major American city in the United States. And so you like pull up the Washington Post when you all get home. If you're a nerd, we used to have ProQuest on ready to go when you get home. But pull up the Washington Post from the late 1960s. There's all these stories about babies being bitten in their crib by rats, by a rat infestation so bad in parts of Shaw that it's really an embarrassment to the larger city. And there was legislation in Congress, I think it was 1966 or 67, where Congress was going to appropriate money for rat abatement in major American cities, DC in particular. And segregationists laughingly called it a civil rats bill and voted it down, right? Forget those poor black people in the cities, right? This is just like the Voting Rights Act. We don't need it. And Mary and Barry would walk into neighborhoods and say that the reason your child was bitten by a rat is because these racists in Congress have control of this city. And if we can take that back, we can take that control back from them. Your child will not be bitten by rats. We will kill those rats. Your government will kill those rats. And he said that about slum housing. In Shaw, late 1960s, 3/4 of the housing units in that entire neighborhood. Shaw is, for those of you who don't know the city that well, Shaw is the largest sort of contiguous black neighborhood right in the middle of the city, basically stretching from here upwards to U Street, right? Massive. And it was the blackest neighborhood, poorest neighborhood in the city at the time. And 3/4 of the housing units were owned by absentee slumlords. 3/4 of the housing units were owned by absentee slumlords. And the city did not crack down on them and enforce housing codes. And I mean, the slumlords were so arrogant that they would give interviews to the Washington Post. You can actually find, again, a whole set of articles where someone would sit down with reporters, knowing it would go into a major circulation newspaper and saying, yeah, I don't fix the heat in my building when it's going to break because these Negroes don't have anywhere else to live in the city. Or if the roof is leaking, I kid you all not, if the roof is leaking, I don't fix it because I'm hoping the federal government will come in here and bulldoze the entire neighborhood through urban renewal. So I'm waiting to cash out, and I don't want to invest in the property before the feds come in here and bulldoze it. But there are people living in those apartments, right? And Barry is telling those people, if we get a home rule government, we'll enforce the rent codes and drive these MFs out of business, right? And he just kept going. And so there's this way in which, you know, and the Free DC movement did block parties all summer 1966 going into 1977, where they would go into neighborhoods where folks, you know, had never voted in their lives, right? Remember, we used to vote in the 1870s, right? Here's the 1960s. And he said, you know, if we get active, if we get home rule, things can change for us here. And it made it real material, right? And when we hear current elected officials talking about statehood, they talk about things like the stadium deal, they talk about things like Metro, and you don't get, I think, the same connection. You don't get the same buy-in from people. And so I'll leave it at that. But I think that, you know, there's that need to sort of make our lack of representation material for people, even our lack of representation in Congress. And I think there's also this sort of.
If you could put the microphone a little closer,
Oh,
I just got
sure.
a note because they want to hear it
Thank you.
online. Thank you.
And I think there's also this, I think a lot of people just say nothing's going to change, right? We forget sometimes, and I'll just say this. I keep telling them, and I don't.
No,
no,
me too.
We forget sometimes that the idea of passing statehood legislation through Congress was a joke before 2016. There's statehood legislation had made it to the floor of Congress in the past. In 1993, Eleanor Holmes Norton puts statehood legislation on the floor in the House of Representatives. And the hope is Democratic control of the Congress, Bill Clinton as president, will be able to push this thing through. A lot of people told her it was premature. But she felt that if we got a vote out there, we'd be able to find out who's voting with us, who's voting against us, and we could pressure those who are voting against us in the Democratic Party. And it lost miserably. Half of the Democratic caucus voted against the statehood bill. All of the Republicans, except for one, a Marylander, God bless him, right? Wayne Gilchrist, I think it was, voted against it. So it only got about 150 votes out of 435 members. It was embarrassing, right? And Republican leadership says after that vote, I hope this will convince DC to never bring this foolishness in front of our faces ever again. This should prove to them that statehood is a joke, right? The only reason it comes back up in 2016 is because national Democrats had come to see that statehood was actually in their interest. Democrats back in '93 voted, they voted however they wanted to because they didn't see DC statehood as being in their interest. California said, we don't want another small state that dilutes the power of our senators. Rural states said, we don't want another state that's just a city because we want the farm interest to be strong. People made up all types of foolishness. Maryland and Virginia Congress people all voted against it except for one or two. And it was because they didn't want their residents who lived in the suburbs but worked in the city taxed, right? Steny Hoyer voted against it. Now he's a big statehood supporter because in '93 he didn't see it in his interest. After 2016 he did, and what made them see that was that 2016 was the second time in 16 years that a Republican contender for the presidency had won the office with a minority of the popular vote. And if you look at where they were getting that majority in electoral college votes, it was Wyoming, it was North Dakota, it was New Hampshire, all these little small population states, some of which had fewer people than Washington, D.C. And you all can do this when you get home too if you feel like playing with Google after you finish with ProQuest, right? If you look at the smallest 5 states by population, they produce 8 Republican senators and 2 independents, if I have that correct. If you look at the top 5 population states, it's even 5 and 5, Democrats, Republicans, right? So the Senate is unbalanced in a partisan manner because Republicans dominate small population states, right? And that gives them this huge advantage in the Senate and in the Electoral College. Democrats see that and say, we need a Democratic Wyoming. And all of a sudden you get all this support for the statehood bill, and it passes in 2020 and 2021. It was but for Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema in the Senate that it didn't actually pass, right? And so now here we are.
Yeah, I think oftentimes the Democrats blame it on the Republicans, but like you said, many of the Democrats were against statehood anyway. I know back in 2008, if I recall correctly, when Obama was elected, 2009, the House and the Senate were all Democrat. And there was a conversation about trying to add one more member, a full representative, not exactly a full representative instead of a delegate, in Congress in exchange for another representative for Utah.
Correct. Right.
That was the kind of the exchange, so that Utah would be most likely a conservative, DC most likely a liberal, and this way you kind of cancel each other out, and at least you have representation.
Right. That was the idea. So Utah had grown tremendously in population, and the idea was that they were going to get a new seat in 2010 after the census. But let's give it to them now, and we'll pair that new Utah member, who definitely was going to be a Republican, with a vote for Washington, D.C., and that was just going to essentially enfranchise Eleanor Holmes Norton as a non-voting delegate. And the way that fell apart was that, and this is, I'm not going to blame Democrats too much for this, but I'm going to blame them. And that is that the National Rifle Association contacted every single member of the House and Senate and said, we're going to get one of our friendly legislators to put an amendment on this bill that says, fine, DC wants a voting member of Congress, cool, we'll give it to them. But DC may never, ever, ever, ever in the future change its gun laws or promulgate gun laws. And so they were essentially going to say DC was going to be an open carry state, and you can never, even once you become a state, change that. And so it's a poison pill amendment, effectively. And the National Rifle Association then said, and we're going to score it, which means that if you vote against this amendment, we're then going to mark you down as someone who's against gun rights. Mm-hmm. And a lot of conservative Democrats, particularly Harry Reid from Nevada, said no go. And so Eleanor Holmes Norton had to abandon the bill. And so we've had a lot of near misses.
Yeah. You mentioned in the book that Washingtonians led the national movements for equality in this country. You speak about that. People like Nicole Hannah-Jones has talked about that in some ways. So what happened? Where is that Black national movement, or that Black movement here, Washingtonians, to be able to make this, I mean, obvious change if we live in a democracy? What was funny is one of the reasons why I was in DC vote, because I was this unique character. Once we invaded Iraq, I'm originally from Iraq. Once we invaded Iraq, I was given the right as an exile to vote in Iraq. Not only was I able to vote for president, I was able to vote for the parliament in Iraq. I live in DC, but I couldn't vote for my representative in DC, which was ironic. Yeah. To add even more insult to injury, my daughters, who had never been to Iraq, barely speak Arabic, were able to vote in the parliament of Iraq by virtue of their father being of Iraqi descent. So it was, obviously the irony is right there. Yeah. And to have that happen was pretty ridiculous. But I wanted to, and I didn't vote in the parliament of Iraq. I didn't think that was appropriate for me to do that because I've been to Iraq forever. But I wanted to ask you, what happened? I mean, you have Marion Barry, who was the Free DC movement, getting people all riled up, talking to poor people and telling them it makes a difference if they have statehood. Then he gets in power, right? Why wasn't that same energy? Why didn't that continue?
So, DC plays this kind of twin role in African-American life in this country. Because it's overseen by Congress, and we've talked about Congress as a malign force in the district's history, Congress can also be, oddly enough, a very positive force in the district's history. So DC is, of course, in the South. And one of the things that you had here in the late 19th century, which was very attractive to African Americans, was people overseeing the city who were both Southerners and Northerners. And so, oddly enough, you had a situation in the district where Northern members of Congress would actually look out for some Black residents in the city. You also had a situation that was just sort of mistakes of history. Um, you know, Congress after the Civil War gives a pretty insufficient but important amount of resources to African Americans as part of the process of Reconstruction. It facilitates the founding of black colleges. It sort of pushes for the establishment of black school systems. In fact, school systems, period, across the South. And what that meant in DC is that Congress mandates the creation of the DC school system as a segregated school system, but in the same legislation mandates that black teachers be paid the same as white teachers. And that legislation is never repealed. So if you're in South Carolina and you're there as a black teacher in the 1860s, for a brief moment, you may get paid the same as white teachers, but then there is the overthrow of the Reconstruction governments, and the state legislature then fundamentally shifts your pay scale. And you could be a black teacher teaching since the 1860s, and you can literally watch your income go down as compared to your white peers. You can watch the allocations for how much is spent on each of your students and on the buildings that you teach in each year relative to their white peers, right? So South Carolina, I think it was like a quarter gets spent on black students for every dollar on a white student by the time you get to the turn of the century. In DC, it's still the same because no one's going to repeal that law that was passed back during Reconstruction. And so if you're an African American anywhere in the South and you have a college education, somehow through hook or crook, you were able to get a college education, and you plan to be a teacher, the logical place to come in all of the country is Washington, D.C., because it has the largest black high school in the country in Dunbar. It has the best pay scale, bar none. It also has Howard University and Freedmen's Hospital, both of which are supported by the federal government and would grow to become the largest black college in the country, right? And so the federal government is able to sort of build up the black middle class. And it continues to, and what that does though is it attracts people from around the country. Frederick Douglass moves here. PBS Pinchback, who was the only black governor during Reconstruction. After he steps down, he leaves Louisiana and moves here. Blanche K. Bruce, former senator from Mississippi, after he steps down and is almost killed in Mississippi, he moves here, right? And you can go on and on and on. All of the luminaries of the late 19th century either are sort of drawn here by our cultural institutions, our educational institutions, or flee here from a South that is no longer hospitable to elite black folks.
What years around? What were the years of that kind of migration?
So the major migration for the black elite is the 1880s and 1890s, but you can see a big chunk of them in the 1870s as well. And just to give you an idea of how attractive this place is for them, I think, after the Black Lives Matter protests, we were all sort of down on the Lincoln Memorial in Lincoln Park in Capitol Hill. How many people have seen it, the Lincoln Memorial in Lincoln Park off of East Capitol Street? So we got like 4 folks here, right? It is a horrible statue. It's Lincoln standing in like a 3-piece suit over an almost naked enslaved person who's sort of breaking his chains. Lincoln's
kind of groveling on the floor.
Yeah, and Lincoln is holding the Emancipation Proclamation. And that was the first ever bronze statue commissioned and paid for by freed people in the history of the country. And all national celebrations of Lincoln until the building of the Lincoln Memorial set off from that statue. And black folks had paid for that statue. Unfortunately, they hired a rather racist sculptor to put it together, but it's the 1870s. What do you want, right? And when the statue was unveiled, Frederick Douglass speaks to the president, most of the cabinet, several members of the Supreme Court, and much of the leadership of Congress. Basically, the bulk of the leadership of the federal government. The next time that happens is January in 2009, when a black person speaks to that many powerful white people in the U.S. government. And that's the inauguration of Barack Obama, right? So,
But that didn't happen near the statue there. That's,
no, that happened in front of the statue.
no, but you're talking about Barack Obama.
Oh, no, that happened
That's-
down the road.
No, no.
Yeah, sorry. So it's like that's what people were seeing from elsewhere in the South, where, lynching is starting to become a, 2 and 3 times a week thing across the South. Like, that's what DC looked like to a lot of Southerners. So they begin coming here in large numbers, and you get a lot of the leadership of the black community. Mary Church Terrell comes here. Frederick Douglass comes here. All of the Reconstruction elected officials I mentioned come here. And they provide a pretty impressive leadership to the community. That leadership ages out over time, and the new leadership has to grow in the 1930s, right? Same thing happens in the 60s. A couple years ago, I tried, does everybody know what the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee is? It is the SNCC. It is the organization that Marion Barry was a co-founder of. He was the first chairman of SNCC. And of course, he moves to DC in 1965 to run the SNCC office, which used to be on Rhode Island Avenue. And what made Marion Barry, both as an activist and as an elected official, was certainly his charisma, was certainly his attention to detail. He is arguably the best retail politician in the last 70 years to have lived in this city. And he had about 40 close friends who were arguably the best organizers in the country, moving into DC at the same time that he did, and he's leveraging their skills on his activist projects, on his electoral campaigns, and on his administration. And you can count them, roughly 40 SNCC activists. And I mean, these are people that had been hanging out with Fidel Castro. These are people that had registered quite literally tens of thousands of folks in Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia. These are folks who had planned the Sixth Pan-African Congress in 1976 in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, right? I mean, these are skilled activists. And he could just turn to them and be like, I need to increase the numbers for affirmative action contracts for the city. So he hires Portland Cox, right? One of the most brilliant activists to have ever lived in the city. And so you get this influx of people because DC is this place that has this huge black population. That population is more affluent compared to other places around the country. And for Barry and his ilk, the challenge was not only that there were about 500,000 black folks here, but that they couldn't vote. And so the exciting part was 500,000 black folks. The challenge was getting the vote for that 500,000 black folks, essentially trying to do exactly for DC what they had done for Alabama, right? And the beauty is that they did, but then they aged out, right? Roughly in the late 1990s, early 2000s. And we have not seen a similar influx or a similar sort of crisis that would raise up a new generation of leadership. We're sort of in this odd moment of confusion when the older group of leaders has sort of begun to fade away and a new group has not gelled yet. I pray they come soon because we're in bad shape.
So you're saying that when you say that, you mean like they were not able to mobilize enough people to be able to get statehood, or get? I mean, we're talking about statehood.
Yeah.
And why hasn't that happened? Being that the black politicians in Washington, or the elite blacks in Washington, should have been able to make that change, because they've made other changes about other things that have happened that have had national impact. What happened with statehood? Why wasn't statehood their main focus? I don't remember Marion Barry speaking a lot about statehood. He didn't. I mean, that's the thing. I think I hear Muriel Bowser speaking a lot about statehood, but I rarely heard Marion Barry speak about statehood.
Right.
Was that a strategic thing for him because he didn't want to sort of poke the bear in a sense and just kind of?
Yeah, no, it's an excellent question. So there's two reasons. The first is that And we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that Barry and his cohort got us to the door of statehood, right? So it's Barry and his cohort. And Walter Fauntroy should really be shouted out. He was our non-voting delegate before Eleanor Holmes Norton. Should really be shouted out as one of the driving forces behind this. But Barry and his cohort got us home rule. They got us a vote in Congress on the D.C. Voting Rights Amendment, which was an amendment to the Constitution. This was drafted by Walter Fauntroy, and it passes Congress in 1978. And it was an amendment to the Constitution that mandates that D.C. be treated as though it were a state for purposes of representation in the House and the Senate. So when it passed in 1978, it not only would have given us 2 members of the Senate, it would have given us 2 members of the voting members of the House, because back then the size of House districts was a bit smaller, so we would have gotten 2, right? And it passes the Congress. I mean, it is amazing that this passed the Congress. It then has to go to the states so for ratification. And new right activists, people like Phyllis Schlafly, Pat Buchanan, Ronald Reagan, all mobilize out in the states to kill it. And you go into state legislatures like in Louisiana, and people will be like, "Yeah, that seems fair. Like, I'm willing to vote for it." I mean, it's remarkable, like, to hear it from the vantage of today. And then Pat Buchanan would come in and say, "Well, look, if you vote for this, that's 2 more votes for the Equal Rights Amendment. That's 2 more votes for union protections. That's 2 more votes for affirmative action. That's 2 more votes for all the things you hate, right? Don't vote for it, even though DC residents really do kind of have a legitimate beef, right? And Pat Buchanan knew that because he grew up here, right? And so, we've actually found private correspondence that we quote in the book where he says, like, I know that the way that DC is governed is wrong, but we don't want 2 more Democratic senators. And so we're urging everybody to vote against it. And they mobilized the Gun Owners of America, the American Legislative Exchange Council, all these new right organizations, and they kill it in the states. But what I think we should not forget is that Barry and Fauntroy and that generation got us 2 things that most DC residents didn't think they were going to see in their life, right? Home rule and a vote on the DC Voting Rights Amendment. Once the DC Voting Rights Amendment collapses, it's really an anti-homelessness activist named Ed Guinan, who is the head of a group called the Community for Creative Nonviolence. Wonderful anti-Vietnam War protester. Yes, that's right. So they worked with the city to create a homeless shelter on 4th Street. That's the largest homeless shelter in the city till today. And DC really had a horrible homelessness problem that CCNV worked hard to address. Like every winter, you'd get half a dozen people that would freeze to death sleeping in cars or on subway breaks and stuff. It was a real problem. But he took Marion Barry seriously when Marion Barry was walking around saying, like, we can solve all our problems if we get home rule. He sort of took that one step further and said, we can solve all our problems if we get statehood. And so he passes the statehood referendum. He actually puts it on the ballot. CCNV workers go around the whole city getting people to sign on to it, and it passes. And so at that point, the city is bound to the strategy of gaining statehood in order to get a vote in Congress. And Marion Barry says, absolutely not. Quietly. He doesn't say this publicly, right? Quietly, he says absolutely not. And his thing was, the city has absolutely no solid tax base. When the Home Rule Act was passed, Congress banned us from taxing communities. We can't put tolls on the highways. We can't work out a tax sharing arrangement with Maryland and Virginia. And for the 70s, 80s, and 90s, a majority of white-collar workers who worked downtown, lived outside the city. And so we couldn't touch their incomes. If you add to that the fact that the federal government owns about embassies and churches own about 40-45% of the land in the district, we have a minuscule tax base. right? We can only basically tax businesses and people who live here, right? And that was not enough to fund all the city's needs. And so Barry really wanted a federal payment, right? Where the federal government gives us money for shouldering the burden of hosting the federal government and its massive roads and its mall downtown where nobody from DC actually lives. And so he basically said, I'm not going to talk about statehood because I need to work with these Democrats from the Maryland, Virginia suburbs, make sure we get this good federal payment. And so he just didn't talk about it. And as the city moves towards statehood, he just remains mum. To the point where, people like Julius Hobson, famous statehood activist, really kind of curse him out publicly sometimes. Like, you haven't said a mumbling word about our self-determination. Barry would sort of quietly be like, I gotta balance the budget. And by the time Barry was converted to the statehood cause, late 80s, early 90s, the city's broke. We go bankrupt in 1994. We're the murder capital of the United States of America. There's 60-some open-air crack markets spread across the city. And there's some people in Congress talking about revoking home rule. So that's just a bad time to talk about statehood. So even when Barry gets converted to the cause, he's still not going to talk about it. And then, of course, he retires, going into the early 21st century. And so he really never had occasion for it based on his other needs. And he sort of backs away. And he let Walter Fauntroy sort of run the self-determination stuff.
I think he saw DC as an incubator for Black power, and not so much in itself, that kind of place. You know what I mean? I think he obviously raised a lot of Black folks in the city to a level, and almost you can almost say that. Well, I want to ask you one more question, and then we'll open it up to the audience to ask questions. So please be prepared. We are facing a real crisis right now in the city, being with the new administration and the way that they're putting all the pressure. I know that the current mayor has been criticized by many and has been lauded by others about her approach to this. I am one that has criticized her because I feel like, you are dealing with someone who is unreasonable and is a bully, and you're trying to be reasonable with him, and that doesn't always work. We've seen it happen over and over again, and I don't think we're getting much benefit from buckling to his needs at this point. At least doesn't appear that way. I wanted to ask you, if Marion Barry was here today, how would he handle this current crisis that we're facing? How would he be dealing with someone like a Donald Trump? Just from your research and guesses, how do you think this current crisis would play out? One of the biggest issues, I think, and the main difference between the current mayor and Marion Barry is Marion Barry understood the street. This current mayor does not. She understands this part, but doesn't understand this part. And the majority of the city, that needs to be mobilized is down here. And so she's unable to get that energy that someone like Marion Barry is able to get. But again, back to you, how do you think he would handle the current situation?
I'm going to go for the cheeky answer. I'm not sure he would handle it too much differently,
Okay.
which might surprise some people. We have to start with a recognition that any mayor during the modern home rule period is shockingly vulnerable to the president and to Congress. The Home Rule Act was written so that the president and Congress would have tremendous power over the city. That was done on purpose. we have to remember, when the Home Rule Act is written, the city is 75% black. It had just come off of a very ugly crime crisis and heroin epidemic in the late 1960s. And Richard Nixon had actually run his 1968 campaign against Washington, D.C. He says he called D.C. the crime capital of the United States, and he's going to come in here and clean it up. And put forward in 1969 a positively draconian crime suppression bill for the district. It was so bad that many Southern conservatives would be like, whoa, this is unconstitutional, dude. I mean, like, no-knock warrants, pretrial detention, like, pretty wild stuff. Gil Scott-Heron wrote a wonderful song about it, famous D.C. resident at the time. And so when debate began on the Home Rule Bill, folks were very clear that they did not want to put the Metropolitan Police Department in the hands not just of a bunch of black people, but a bunch of black people like Marion Barry, like Julius Hobson, people who everybody knew if we have elections, they're going to get elected to the council or the mayorship, right? And DC, in fact, became the first major American city in the United States of America to elect a former black power activist as its chief executive, right? If you look at our council in 1975, so 13 members, right? 11 of them were former civil rights, black power, or anti-poverty activists, right? So everybody understood that going into the debates. And so they made sure that the federal judges were not in any substantive way controlled by local government. They basically said, okay, we're just going to make sure the president appoints your judges. And you guys can have an advisory board that tells the president what list he can pick from. But he still picks and the Senate confirms. You don't have any more control than that. That's different than states. The president can take over your police force during emergencies, and he can define what an emergency is. The president maintains control of our National Guard. The president appoints our chief prosecutor, the U.S. attorney. And this has since been declared unconstitutional, but in the original legislation, a single House of Congress could vote to disapprove of a D.C. criminal law, and it would be nullified right then and there. Just the House or just the Senate didn't need a presidential signature, right? The Supreme Court declared that unconstitutional in 1984, so that no longer happens. But the idea in the legislation was that this was going to be a partnership, and the federal government was the senior partner. That was the basic idea, right? And so that means that any mayor who runs this city is very clear that they are the junior partner in a relationship with the federal government, unless someone in the federal government decides not to intervene, right? And here we have a president who is determined to intervene, right? And so I get the sense, particularly from what he did in the late 80s and during the 90s, that Barry would have cut the same deals as Bowser when it came to the executive order she issued in order to get Trump to stop the emergency. Because Trump was about to work with Congress to ram through an extension, or even to obliterate the 30-day cap on presidential emergencies and the ability to take over the MPD. And Bowser, working with his chief of staff, who she has a reasonably good relationship with, worked out this deal where she would create sort of a catchment for the president's wishes, which is established by her executive order, and then they would transmit it through the city government so that we didn't lose control of that process. And that was her compromise, where I think she really pissed people off, because I think a lot of DC residents, quite frankly, understood that difficulty she had, is that she did something Barry wouldn't do, which is that she said, "Thank you, Mr. President, for violating our rights," in that press conference, right? And that's when the council broke with her for the first time. I mean, she's been appeasing the president for 8 months now, right? And no one on the council has said much until she said thank you, right? And it's because they all understand what she's dealing with. Barry, I think, from Jump Street would have been like, we really hate this. I mean, we really, really hate this. But, the president worked it out. And you can see that because back in the late 1980s, when we become the murder capital of the United States, crack was running crazy in the city. Republicans in Congress and some Democrats forced the city to hire 1,800 new MPD officers. Their idea was if you swarm the streets, you can actually take care of this stuff. And Barry said, look, we don't have the capacity to train them. We just don't. Like, please don't do this. We don't have the capacity. But they insisted, and so he hired them. And the two classes that came in after he was forced to hire those 1,800 officers were the deadliest classes in MPD's modern history, the classes of 90 and 91. They weren't vetted. They weren't properly trained. They were also issued these new guns that nobody really heard of called Glocks. They had a whole lot more bullets and a slightly easier trigger than six-shooters. And they killed tons of people. They worked for drug dealers. I mean, it was a rough class. And, you know, there were tons of good cops in that class, but they struggled with some of their colleagues. And so Barry's had to knuckle under as well. I just don't think, to your point, he'd ever be willing to admit that level of knuckling under to his constituents in a way that the current mayor has. But I will give the current mayor this. And I'm not a big fan of this, but I will give her this. She said something in one of her recent press conferences, I think that's quite advisable and should be a challenge to the council and anybody else out there. She said, well, somebody else thinks they can do it better. Like, there's an election coming up, right? And I think that in the end, she feels like she has a bit of freedom to move because she's about to run for her 4th term. And there is not someone on the horizon. Carl Racine has left the city. Kenny McDuffie is not interested. Robert White may be gearing up, but it's hard to see it. And I think she has a pretty good assessment. Like, I think she's right in her assessment that there's not anybody out there who can take advantage of her rhetorical misstep. And so she's open to appeasing Trump because she has to. She has a little bit more space on the rhetorical side than Barry does, and she used it. And unless somebody steps up, she's not going to pay the price.
I think Robert White seems to be really gearing up. I mean, I know what he's doing, and I think he has found an opening in this moment to distinguish himself. Yes, it's easier when you're on the outside to be able to say, this is terrible, you buckle to this bully, right, and so on, right? And you're always going to win points for that. No one's going to say no, you know, unless you're like super good friends with the mayor. Right. But so most of the people are going to say, yeah, he's speaking about pride, you know, and we are a prideful city, especially when it comes to black pride. You have this white racist that is kind of dealing with the city like it's his plantation.
But I'll come full circle real quick and then and end things there, at least on my side, which is that one thing I think that Robert needs to develop that Mary and Barry had is rhetorically, he needs to be able to communicate to folks who have largely checked out that fighting back will affect their everyday lives. He needs to find that message, which is that fighting Trump will keep rats from biting your baby, like Barry, exactly, right? Second thing, because, you know, what a lot of folks east of the river are concerned about is, you know, housing. You know, and fighting Trump seems separate from that, right? And quite frankly, public safety. Yeah. And I think the mayor has found a way to corner that issue, right? The other thing, though, I think, is that Mary and Barry could count really damn well. So Mary and Barry comes out of jail. Everybody knows that he was caught in an FBI sting smoking crack. He goes to jail for 1.5 years. He comes back and he plans to run for council, and then he immediately plans to run for mayor again. And he knew for a fact that he had lost white voters in Ward 3, period. That was done. That was never going to happen again, right? And so he looked at registration across the city, and registration west to east was high in Ward 3, and it slowly declined through the black middle class districts of the middle of the city, and then it fell off a cliff in the black working class and poor districts of Ward 7 and 8 across the river, right? So it literally just was like a straight line downward across the city. He said, if I'm going to win the mayorship, I have to flatten that line. Instead of it going down from Ward 3 to Ward 8, it's got to go flat from Ward 3 to Ward 8. And for 2 years, he registered black voters in Ward 7, 8, 6, 5. And by the time the 1994 election came along, registration numerically was even, Wards 3 to 8. Only time it's ever happened in modern DC history. And then those people turned out. So he builds a whole operation for registration and for turnout that's his own. And anyone who's going to beat the mayor, I think not only has to have this message that penetrates and it speaks to people's needs, but they can also mobilize populations that just flat out aren't part of the equation. And if you look at Ward 8, for instance, which really helps to propel Barry to the mayor's office, one of the greatest political comebacks in modern American history in 1994. Turnout in the last couple elections in Ward 8, contested elections, like big time elections where, you know, Trayon White was, you know, to be retired or not, right? Turnout doesn't top 20-25%. A couple of years ago in the mayoral election, it was like 16%. And so that has to be changed. If
That's in Ward 8 you're talking
that's
about.
in Ward 8.
Yeah.
And so someone's going to have to change those numbers
Yeah.
if they want to see
Much higher in Ward 3 and Ward 4
Yeah.
and Ward 2 and all those. Yeah, I think you're spot on. I think the other thing is, how do you know, it's one thing to register people, it's another to mobilize them, and Mayor Barry was able to do that, which is remarkable. One last question also I wanted to ask you is about our current representative in Congress, Eleanor Holmes Norton. Donna Brazil recently penned an op-ed that was pretty much spot on to say, you know what, we love you, but you need to step down. It's time for somebody with a little bit more energy. But back to the mayor, as you were talking, but you know, how can you get somebody to mobilize people and make them understand what affects their lives and be able to, you know, come out? We need a black Mamdani, is what we need. A black version of Mamdani to be able to run here in the city. Someone young, someone energetic who can able to mobilize people like that.
And I'll add one thing. And yes, I really do encourage everyone who has not seen the Donna Brazil op-ed, which is in the Washington Post, on asking Eleanor Holmes Norton to retire. I really do recommend it. I do think that the delegate, who's had a long and wonderful career, should retire, and she should tell everyone that she is going to retire. She's been back and forth for the last couple of months, not being specific about that. I'll say one thing about a black Mamdani for DC. I think we have to be honest about how the city has changed in the last 25 years and figure out if in fact we need a black Mamdani or if we just need a Mamdani. And I'm saying that as someone who wrote the book Chocolate City, right? I think the major divide in the city for so long was a racial one, and still is to a significant degree, that we have missed the moderate versus progressive divide that has grown up and that is interracial on either side in the last 20 or so years. And look, if a good candidate who spoke like Mamdani arose in the next couple months and they were white or Asian or Latino, I would struggle to find a reason to not vote for them. And so because the city is not 75% black. It's 40.
But as you say, the whole term Chocolate City has such a strong and powerful kind of meaning to people in the city, especially to Black people, it would be a huge disappointment, I think, to many Black folks in the city to see a city that had the potential to be the most powerful Black city in the country be kind of like swept from underneath them. And the other irony would be is then we would get statehood. You know what I mean? It's like that's the part that's always the other part is like,
mean,
oh,
if that's the price, I might be willing to.
you
go
might
for
take it. Well,
but you know, I think that obscures the fact that Black folks have been losing the city under Black mayors for 20 years.
Absolutely.
And so, what are we really talking about here? I mean, that is. Don't get me wrong. I think like many folks would struggle with the change. DC is Chocolate City for many of us who grew up during the Chocolate City years, and so it would require an adjustment, right? But that being said, it's just a different time, and if one of the things that animated the Chocolate City years was self-determination, proper representation for different racial groups, sort of roughly in coordination with their representation in the population, then, in a city that's roughly 43% white, roughly 43% Black with Latinos, Asians, and others making up the rest, I'm willing to do a round robin on the mayorship. I don't know if others agree with me there, but I think we have to be honest and begin to have that conversation about the reality of DC right now, as opposed to its rich history, which, to be fair, I'm invested in.
Do you think if Eleanor was to step down, that Bowser would go for that?
No.
No, you don't think so? That would be like a downgrade. That'd be a downgrade.
Not even. Oh God, yes. Yeah, I mean, what would she do all day?
Well, that's the beauty. That's the beauty of it. You have all the perks without having to do anything.
Yeah. I don't get the sense that that's of much interest to her.
Really?
I mean, she's a hardworking, deal-making woman.
But I mean, that'd give her a new life. She could really work for statehood in a real way. I mean, I think Eleanor has been just kind of like skating through her last few years, obviously, not really doing a whole lot. I think someone with a lot of energy can actually use that position to create a much higher profile for themselves. I know that she's the mayor. We already know her. We already know what she's like. But I think for her to go to that might be an upgrade of her image. But I don't know. What do I know? I know nothing.
I just don't see it.
Okay.
But, I think there's a couple people on the council. In fact, the head of the Ward 3 Dems just declared for the non-voting delegate position, I think, earlier today. And I think there's a lot of people out there that want that job, that know that job, and I hope they jump in. I hope they don't defer to Eleanor, because I just don't think she's up to the job.
Agreed. All right. Yes, I'll vote for you. But anyway, let's open it up for a couple questions. All the way in the back, can you? I think Blair here can probably bring the microphone over to you. So hang in there for a second. If you can speak really loud. Yeah, I think we need to hear it online. Blair, are you ready with the microphone, or should we scrap that? Why don't you come up toward the front? You can use one of our microphones here for now. Yep. Okay.
Will this reach? So, in terms of the current moment and what's going on, taking a step back, going back to March and sort of taking $1 billion from the DC budget, a lot of people were wondering kind of what's going on. And then we see reports, somebody overhears at a restaurant, a conversation. I work for the Trump administration. My job is to tank the local economy. Like, you should get out while you can. You also see reports sort of linked to Peter Thiel, interest in privatizing cities and freedom communities and gated communities. I was wondering if you're seeing any dots like that connecting where maybe something happening now is different than before, taking into account some of these more, well, some of the types of influences I described, and not just taking away home rule, but perhaps what a more privatized transformation of DC could look like for the benefit of those in power?
I actually see more continuity than change here. I mean, the difference is that the crisis is manufactured this time around. But if you look at the mid-1990s, when the city goes bankrupt and the control board is put in place, and there's a really aggressive move in Congress to shape the city's, not just its finances, which is the purview of the control board, but its laws. And so Congress is literally passing a significant amount of legislation to change the way the district operates. And that's when you get vouchers, that's when you get charter schools, that's when you get enterprise zones, all these privatized solutions to the problems of the inner city poor, quote unquote, pitched by people like Jack Kemp, who was, of course, the advisor to Newt Gingrich at the time. So he had a very specific hand in this. And so it doesn't feel like, I mean, look, even the 1997 law that bailed the city out, essentially assumed a great deal of our debt, shifts all of DC's felons into the Bureau of Prisons. And as part of that, sort of speaks very highly of private federal prisons as the best place to put DC prisoners. Now that doesn't pan out in the same way I think some of the people that crafted that legislation thought. The majority of the felons that DC sends into the Bureau of Prisons end up in federally run prisons that are owned by the government. But all that was on the table. As sort of privatization was the solution to the failure of a socialist-looking democratic city government, right? I think that basic thrust is coming back. But when it comes to, say, the emergency and Trump's invocation of the Home Rule Act to try and have oversight of MPD, I don't know if there's a grand scheme behind that. From the reporting I've seen, and this is a problem because you don't have vision behind the veil, right, behind the curtain. It's not clear if the carving of $1 billion out of the DC budget was even intentional. What we know was intentional is that nobody made a serious effort to put it back, right? Even after the president says, go ahead and put it back. And folks in the House are like, no. So it's hard to tell. I mean, and that is, there's a way that can be comforting, right? There's no grand scheme. Hopefully these guys will screw up. So I think how a lot of national Democrats kind of processed the entire Trump administration back in January, February, right? We'll wait for them to mess up and then we'll swoop in and regain the majority, which is absolutely not a good plan, right? But it's not clear to me, at least on the ground, that all this sort of makes sense together. I think Trump is making up a lot of this stuff as he goes along. We do know, though, that he'll always come back to the well with DC because he can, right? LA, there's a court case. He's going to wind that down. Chicago, there's unified opposition from the governor and the mayor. He's going to leave that alone, right? Memphis works because he has a Republican governor and he can attack a Democratic city. That's his new crime of opportunity, right? And when that gets hard, he might come right back to DC. In fact, he forecast that 2 days ago, right? When the mayor, got pressed and said, we're not focusing on coordinating with ICE. So we know it'll happen again, but is there a rhyme or reason? That's not clear, as far as I can tell.
We have a microphone now, so anyone have a question? We'll do a book signing also afterwards. So if you haven't gotten the book, he's going to be sitting right here signing the books as you come up to the stage. It's a great book. It's a great resource book. It's half the book is footnotes and an index in there. So it's a lot of really good research. Hello? Hello?
So earlier you how voter Oh, hello?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, like you're singing, sounded like that.
So earlier you were talking about how voter turnout had sort of decreased since the 80s, and I was wondering if you think that like it's losing hope in DC democracy, or if it's sort of related to the increase in like young professionals and transplants coming into the city that are registered to vote elsewhere.
So it hasn't declined across the board. What I was talking about specifically is the east of the river wards. And so if you look at, say, voter registration and turnout graph for wards 7 and 8, what you'll see is relative consistency. 7 is going to be higher than 8. It's got the Silver Coast over there, and so it's always had this sort of politically active black middle class that kind of dominates or intended to dominate the ward. Ward 8 is much poorer by comparison, right? And so Ward 8 has had lower turnout kind of across the board. But what you see is in the 80s, you have like relatively even turnout. There's just this huge blip in the early 90s, and then it falls right back down to be relatively low. And that's just Marion Barry, right? He puts together just that huge turnout operation. I think there's two things there. And I should point out that the abysmally low turnout of the early 21st century is relatively new for those two wards. And I think there's sort of two things for that. One is that you don't have a targeted registration and turnout campaign, which Barry worked with Rock Newman, a local boxing promoter, put a lot of money into, and I mean, they were literally like going up to crack houses and being like, look, I know you got an addiction, but you can vote. So let's get you registered, right? It was a remarkable operation. They weren't leaving anyone out. If you're a citizen, you can vote, right? So let's get you registered, let's get you turned out. Aside from not having that operation, what you also have, I think, in some of the east of the river wards, is the feeling that there's not someone on the citywide level who's seriously talking to you and to your needs. And Barry, whether he was always going to fulfill those needs or not, was able to communicate to people that he felt their needs and he was going to at least try to fulfill their needs. And there was a real sense, particularly in the last couple of mayoral elections in those wards, that there was nobody out there who was seriously dealing with their needs. And they showed it by not turning out. And so I think that you have to have two things. I mean, one is you have to have someone who speaks to them, and two, you have to have someone who's going to put together an organization that can sort of rebuild the political infrastructure in those areas.
I do see also, however, that a lot of people do not see how, like you said earlier, how having a member in Congress and 2 senators is going to change their life in any material way. I think for a lot of people, it really doesn't make any sense. I mean, they look at the national politics and they see it as being dirty and nasty and all about deal making and all about money. And it doesn't feel like they have any say in that, So for them, they're not interested in creating an employment opportunity for, Democrats that need to, rise above the state of mayor, So I think that's that's the sense that I get, and speaking to folks in Ward 8 and Ward 7, is that there really isn't. There's no excitement for statehood. There really is no excitement for statehood in those parts of the cities.
Yeah.
Anyone else has any questions? Over here.
Hey.
Thanks. Hey, Andy. Hey, Derek. Just wanted to ask, and really challenge you, Derek, on giving credit to the mayor for her saying that if there's someone better, take your aim at this seat. But if you really think about it, this goes back to the Norton issue that Norton clearly has stayed too long, and succession is actually love. And so if she or any other black political leader really cares and loves about the work and the job that they do, they're preparing the next to come along. And it is sad that after 4 terms, which will be, right, that there's no one within her circle, in her cohort, that she is brought up as city administrators, et cetera, or even leaders within respective agencies that are prepared and ready to take that seat, that she can hand the baton off to, because that's how we get in the predicament of not having leadership to take the next, to run that next leg of leadership for this city or any others. And you look at Atlanta as a great example where, I don't know about the current mayor there, but all the mayors up through Kasim Reed even were somehow directly or indirectly acolytes of Mayor Jackson. And that has just been a very different pattern and trajectory for DC.
I mean, I'm pretty sure that people on her staff, Norton's staff, have told her that she's out of gas. And you can see that in the weird back and forth that come out of that office. I'm running, I'm not running. And you can see which one of those are written by the member and which one of those are written by the staff. And as a former congressional staffer, I worked for Alcee Hastings. You can only tell the member so much. You certainly can't tell the member what to do, right? And I think that her staff is struggling with that, and that's why Donna Brazile felt that she needed to write the op-ed, essentially say, I used to be a staffer, I'm not now, and you got to go. Because you're not listening to all the people who are trying to tell you more gingerly than I. With the mayor, I mean, look, she's at the top of her game. And so I think she has a whole different set of considerations. And the big one is, who's going to beat her? I mean, because look, politicians, like there's a certain continuity between the two of them, which is, I know how to do this job better than anybody else. And typically you have to be that arrogant to be an elected official, right? It's just part of the profile. Politicians I like and I don't like, I think that way, right? And then there's a question of ability, right? Which is that the mayor can say that to herself, and it can roughly be true, right? Like, she has gas in the tank. The delegate can say that to herself, and it could not be true. She doesn't have any more gas in the tank. And so I think there are two different cases in that regard. But I think when it comes right down to it, to your point, elected officials should always be challenged. If for no other reason, even if you don't want to get rid of them, to sort of sharpen their knives and keep them on their toes, right? Like to make sure that they're able to defend themselves and that they're not just cruising. And so I think competition would be a good idea anyway. Whether or not we'll have that is depends on the people who want to challenge it.
I think one other thing, especially for black folk in the city, I think they go for the tried and true as opposed to the risk, the more risky. So they're always willing to, settle for the devil they knew than to go and find someone, some whippersnapper coming out of nowhere who's promising the world. And, they've been let down so many times that they can't really trust them. So I think that she has that advantage as well. And that she is a known entity, like her or not. She hasn't done anything awful. So she's someone people are willing to hang their head on just because.
Yeah, I mean,
they know her.
I mean, whoever runs against her has to make the case.
Right. And they have to do it now because, it has to start pretty soon because you need to be able to have that momentum because it is about name recognition after all when it comes to running for office. How well I know that. Anyone else have any questions? I think we're just, let me ask you one final question. Would you be interested in running at any time? Is that something in your psyche?
I, I, the
I
simple
think he is. When he hesitates, that's how politicians are.
The simple answer is no.
Okay.
I have at least 2 more books in me and a website, and maybe when those are done and I'm a slow writer, I'll evaluate the question. But right now, absolutely
Well, we would be behind you.
not. Okay.
So,
I will take a check from
yeah,
Andy
yes, you
Shallal,
will.
so-
Indeed, indeed. Yep, always. All right, so we're going to do the book signing right here. I want to say a very special thank you to Derek Musgrove. Thank you so much. It's been great chatting with you.
And thank you to Andy, who's too humble to thank himself.